Hello and welcome back to Lady Disdain Reads. It's been quite some time since my last video, so if any of you are new, my name is Beatrice and I make videos about literature, especially about Jane Austen. I just moved to a new place. I moved from Canada to the United States, so this is a slightly new background, and after the madness of the move, I am back with a video that I've been meaning to make for a long time. In today's video, I'm going to talk to you about Mary Wollstonecraft and the idea of virtuous parenthood and why this matters to our understanding of Jane Austen's novels. So let me begin with a brief introduction to a thinker that has been instrumental in my understanding of the works of Mary Wollstonecraft. You may think you know what Wollstonecraft is arguing in her famous Rights of Woman, but Erika Bachiochi's book, The Rights of Women Reclaiming a Lost Vision, which was published only last year, may well change your mind, or at least give you a greater understanding of her ideas, a more nuanced understanding of her ideas. So Erika Bachiochi is actually a legal scholar, so she's not a literary critic at all. And she's seeking to essentially reframe Wollstonecraft's understanding of rights. For Wollstonecraft, she argues, rights are not inherently good, but rather they are necessary to a life of virtue, so they're the necessary means to conducing a virtuous life. What this means practically is that a woman should have the right to an education and an existence as an equal to her male counterparts, not just so that she can be free from oppression, although that is good within itself, but also, more importantly, so that she can be free to be a better citizen, a better mother, a better wife, a better person overall. And the same goes for men, for Wollstonecraft. So Bachiochi thinks that for Wollstonecraft, having rights is about really being better equipped to carrying out a life of duties. So with freedom, we have the duty to use that freedom wisely. Bachiochi thus characterizes Wollstonecraft's feminist ideas and ideals as framed by an ethical project. For Bachiochi, Wollstonecraft is really a virtue ethicist after Aristotle. And just to flag this up here, I have many videos in which I discuss virtue ethics in Jane Austen, especially my very first video that I made, so some of those might be helpful for context here, and I will link them in the description below. In particular, Wollstonecraft emphasizes the importance of effective parenthood in the nurturing of virtue. Children, of course, benefit from virtuous parents, but mothers and fathers themselves grow in virtue by improving in their parental and pedagogical duties. Now, how does all of this relate to Austen? I would like to argue that Austen's portrayal of the vices and virtues of parents in her novels benefits greatly from a comparison to Wollstonecraft's own understanding of virtue. Firstly, Wollstonecraft's emphasis on the primacy of parenthood for both men and women, note that's very important, is paralleled in Austen's works. So in her book on Wollstonecraft and on female rights, Bachiochi claims this: Wollstonecraft viewed attentive fatherhood as deeply transformative of men. The character of a husband, a father, forms the citizen imperceptibly by producing a sober manliness of thought and orderly behaviour. So in the latter part of that quotation, she is quoting from Wollstonecraft herself. Those are her very own words. Wollstonecraft's insistence on character being formed, not simply being received or not simply existing, is deeply Aristotelian, as it points to virtue being gained through habit. So think back to when she's saying in that quotation I just read to you, the character of a husband, a father forms the citizen. That's very important. It is also clear here that Wollstonecraft does not view becoming virtuous as a kind of in a solipsistic way or for one's own sake, let's say, but rather in order to better carry out one's civic duty. Let's think about how this maps onto Austen's characters. In Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Bennet refuses to engage in active and effective parenthood when he allows Lydia to go to Brighton with the Fosters. After her elopement with Wickham, Mr. Bennet justly blames himself for his neglectful parenting style. It is important here that we do not merely blame Mrs. Bennet for having fostered Lydia's silliness. Mr. Bennet, as the father, is held just as responsible. If parenthood is equally the duty of men and of women, it does not just follow that men should be good fathers, but also that women should be given the tools to be informed and effective mothers. Wollstonecraft, as is quoted in Bachiochi's book, writes that women cannot be confined to merely domestic pursuits, for they will not fulfill family duties unless their minds take a wider range. And while they are kept in ignorance, they become, in the same proportion, the slaves of pleasure as they are the slaves of men. Very powerful words there, I should say. The important point that's being made here is that women who solely dedicate themselves to what Wollstonecraft calls domestic pursuits and who remain uneducated will not be good mothers. So it's counterproductive for Wollstonecraft. Women, she thinks, need to be educated to improve their own lives and also to better carry out their duties to their families. Think about, for example, Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. At the end of the very first chapter, the narrator describes her as follows: a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news. Mrs. Bennet's ineffectiveness is apparent later on in the novel as well, in the conversation Elizabeth has with Lady Catherine de Bourgh at Rosings, when it is revealed that none of the Bennet sisters have had much in the way of any education, really. Lady Catherine is surprised to hear that Mrs. Bennet never even employed a governess, telling Elizabeth, "No governess? How was that possible? 5 daughters brought up at home without a governess? I never heard of such a thing. Your mother must have been quite a slave to your education." Elizabeth could hardly help smiling as she assured her that that had not been the case. That's very interesting in itself. Even the language that Lady Catherine is using there, saying your mother must have been quite a slave to your education, that's fascinating because it reminds us of the comment that I just read to you by Wollstonecraft. And it's interesting that to see that Mrs. Bennet, because she herself was not well educated, would have had to become a slave to the education of her daughters in order to give them an effective education. But of course she can't do that because she is herself ignorant, as we are told at the very beginning of the novel. So, furthermore, let's think about how Wollstonecraft makes a distinction between a superficial education, consisting of what would have been known as accomplishments at the time, and true intellectual education that is conducive to a life of virtue. So some of the Bennet sisters, for example, they might be accomplished in the sense that they have kind of social graces, they know how to interact in the world. Well, Elizabeth and Jane do, the younger sisters not so much, but they lack the true intellectual education that for Wollstonecraft would have been conducive to a life of virtue. So Wollstonecraft remarks that women have been allowed to remain in ignorance and slavish dependence many, many years, and vanity makes them value accomplishments more than virtues. So she is using that word accomplishments there, and that's something that's very important in Pride and Prejudice. This juxtaposition of accomplishments and virtues is one that's definitely very much mirrored in Austen. So I think the best example from Pride and Prejudice is the point in the novel where Elizabeth has been staying at Netherfield. And Mr. Bingley, in his kind of typical good humour, begins a discussion about how accomplished young ladies are. His sister Caroline is not so easily impressed. She claims that a woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, the modern languages, to deserve the word. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air, and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved. Mr. Darcy, interestingly, at this point, adds that to all this, she must yet add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. So while Caroline Bingley here is concerned with the air of refinement of young ladies, Mr. Darcy contrasts superficial accomplishments with real improvement of mind, so Mr. Darcy is being quite Wollstonecraftian here. And it is not only Mr. Darcy in Austen's novels that stakes a claim for women cultivating their minds. In Persuasion, for instance, Mrs. Croft reproaches her brother, Captain Wentworth, for his hesitancy to allow a woman aboard his ship. She tells Wentworth this: "But I hate to hear you talking so like a fine gentleman, and as if women were all fine ladies instead of rational creatures. We none of us expect to be in smooth water all our days." The language of rationality here once again echoes Wollstonecraft's claim for rational employment of one's own time. Bachiochi, in her book, tells us that for Wollstonecraft, then, the very first duty of a human being is to develop his or her capacities as a rational creature, to grow in virtue and wisdom. And I think it's really interesting here that we often associate female writers or female thinkers with emotion and feeling and passions, but here we have both Austen and Wollstonecraft talking about being rational creatures. I think that's fascinating. Another great example of the dangers of ineffective parenthood can be found in Mansfield Park. Once again, it is important to remember that for Wollstonecraft, fatherhood is a chief duty of men, not the public life, just as motherhood should be the first duty of women. Sir Bertram's ineffective parenting of his children, especially of Maria and Julia, has consequences both on his daughters and on himself. He is shown to be as morally stunted, basically, as his daughters. Bachiochi thinks that Wollstonecraft has an Aristotelian understanding of how virtuous behaviour is formed, as I was saying to you before. She says, for Aristotle and Wollstonecraft too, virtue was learned little by little, practicing the daily obligations and circumstances of life through the nurture and guidance of a community that seeks to encourage each person's development and ultimately flourishing. By the end of the novel, this is exactly what Sir Thomas comes to understand his own daughters have lacked. The omniscient narrator tells us that Sir Thomas feared that active principle had been wanting, that they had never been properly taught to govern their inclinations and tempers by that sense of duty which alone can suffice. They had been instructed theoretically in their religion, but never required to bring it into daily practice. To be distinguished for elegance and accomplishments, the authorized object of their youth, could have had no useful influence that way, no moral effect on the mind. He had meant them to be good, but his cares had been directed to the understanding and manners, not the disposition. Once again, very interesting word choice there. The narrator tells us that what had been wanting for Maria and Julia in Mansfield Park is the practice of virtue, that their disposition has not been cultivated. This is very Aristotelian and very Wollstonecraftian language. So once again, we see the juxtaposed language of accomplishment versus moral education. There is a real sense of mortification in Sir Thomas. Not only have their daughters lacked the moral education necessary to flourish as individuals, but Sir Thomas himself has failed to flourish in virtue through his very failure as a father. So, after giving you all of these examples of possible links or parallels in Austen's and Wollstonecraft's thinking, the point I want to leave you with at the end of the day is this, and it is one I have learned for myself in the past 6 months since having my son. Parenthood is really grueling work. It requires informed individuals who are capable of, in Wollstonecraft's words, exertion and self-denial. For Wollstonecraft, good parenthood is not about feeling fuzzy feelings, it's not about emotions, but rather about using one's reason to help the moral flourishing of one's children. This understanding of Wollstonecraft's moral vision, then, can aid us in turn to better understand Austen's own portrayal of parenthood. Austen's parental figures are largely reprehensible, if they are there at all, because we have lots of absent parents in Austen as well. We have examples from the valetudinarian Mr. Woodhouse and Emma to the absent Mr. Bennet, and the silly Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, to the vain Sir Walter Elliot in Persuasion, who only cares about looking at himself in his mirror, and the avaricious Admiral Tilney in Northanger Abbey. In the absence of good mothers and fathers, Austen's heroines and heroes are left to grow in virtue by themselves. By the end of each novel, I dare say, each hero and heroine have matured enough that we may only hope that they will be good parents themselves. And I think that's exactly what Wollstonecraft would have approved of. So thank you for watching my video today, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more literary and Austen related content. I don't have a firm plan for my next video yet, but I'm hoping to finally make a video about adaptations of Austen, which is something I've wanted to do for a long time. I hope I can make videos a bit more regularly now that I've moved, but I will say I have just started a PhD, so videos might not come as often as they used to. I might be able to put out one every month or two in the time I have between going to my classes and writing papers and looking after my my baby. So thank you again so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you again in a video not too long in the future. Bye!